go test this thing out. Go to my old house and get into an empty room and do some real experiments. See how it goes. It is now, but I'm going to see if we can address that. Want to keep all the mics and stuff in the same location, so I'm going to have to crouch over. Here's my voice. This is how my voice sounds. We're about 6 inches from the mic. I think the kind of pingy type of things in the ambience are sounding better, but I still hear some room. Day. Ready for day 2 tomorrow. Alright, so now that we tested the empty room, we got to test the acoustic treatment, and I want to start with like the bare minimum and see, you know, how much we actually need. I don't think I'm even in the frame right now, but I just had to take a minute. I'm exhausted, I'm sweating balls here, but I was just thinking to myself how goddamn fortunate I am to be able to do this. Okay, so here we are for the voice. I think it's sounding fairly good, a little bit clearer. I still hear ambience. Okay, do we hear any tonal differences by moving the bass traps into the corners, which should help with nulls in the room? All right, here's what we have now for our vocals. 6 inches off the mic, sounding pretty dead in here. I've got a little bit of reflection behind me from what I can hear. Possibly a more comprehensive set of acoustic treatment can make that, extra 10% of difference. The way it's sounding now is probably pretty in line with a control room. You're probably wondering why the hell I've got these on the floor, and the reason is because I am not sure that I want to put those on the ceiling yet. I might be getting some more panels or making some more, so I didn't want to commit to putting them on the ceiling, but by putting them on the floor, it's achieving the same thing. All right, guys, back in the studio. I am really curious to hear what kind of results we got. Kind of just want to compare between the different acoustic environments, see if there's a difference between the instruments and the monitors. Maybe one case works well for one instrument, but doesn't work for another. That's the kind of stuff I wanted to figure out when doing this test. So let's just take a listen to what we got here. Okay, so not a big difference for the monitoring. The ISO booth curtains actually doesn't sound very good. It kind of just muffles the sound, and let's be honest, no one's going to be doing that for monitoring anyway. That's more for instruments, so I'm not really considering that one. Run. Bass traps sound a little bit. Run. Not as much of a difference as I was expecting. That's bass traps on all the walls. Let's see if putting bass traps in the corners makes any difference. Run. I mean, it's a little bit tighter. You hear less of the reflections going on, but it's not as drastic as I would expect. Let's try bass trap ISO booth, even though, again, no one would do that, but I'm just kind of curious.
Run.
Okay, so that's definitely...
Run.
I don't like it.
Run.
Okay, so this is one we just listened to was with the ceiling cloud. I mean, it's tighter, but there is not as much tonal difference as I was expecting. You know, a lot of the discussion around acoustic treatment isn't just about taming reflections, but it's actually dealing with the nodes and peaks and things, which will, you know, theoretically increase bass frequencies or decrease the clarity in the high frequencies. And I'm not hearing as much of a difference here as I was expecting. It still sounds better in some regards, but a lot of people actually prefer to monitor with the space in the background. It's kind of a more inspiring sound. So let's try the fully treated space. Maybe a bit more clarity with the fully treated room, but we're talking like all the corners, the ceilings, all the early reflection points, bass trapping on the walls behind, bass trapping on pretty much all the surfaces. So here's the thing, when you get into that territory, it ups the expense almost exponentially. And really what I want to determine is if we're really getting that much more extra value, because A, it's a lot of work, but it's really a lot of money. So
Run. Run.
you know, I expected the low frequency decay to be much more drastic between the fully treated space and the not fully treated space. And maybe it's the case that with monitors that extend lower than my Adams do, I think those go down to like 40 hertz, you'd hear a more noticeable difference, but I'm kind of surprised. But let's take a listen to some of the instruments and see if we get a different perspective. Touch over. So this is a mic setup for a very small person, but that's okay. Just want to get a sense of how it's sounding. We're about 6 inches off of the mic, which is a constant. Make it as scientific as possible. I know it's not going to be perfect, but if we were to move things around all the time, it'd kind of 6 inches from the mic. Okay, so that's a much more noticeable difference. This is just the acoustic curtains on the sidewalls, and already but just for the sake of hearing what it sounds like closer, just want to get a sense of how it's sounding. Here's my voice. This is how my voice sounds. We're about 6 inches from the, just want to get a sense of how it's sounding. But you know, one sounds like you're in an empty auditorium or something, and the other one definitely sounds more perfect. But if we were to move things around all the time, try the ISO booth. Does a decent job, but we'll hear in the results. Mono, kind of pingy type of things in the ambience are sounding better. That's not bad. I mean, considering this is like under $50 worth of treatment just to create a kind of isolated space. Home studios where they'll essentially just create this kind of vocal booth out of fabric, which is a pretty good setup for voice and other instruments for close. Home studios where they'll essentially just create. That's not bad at all. It's quite acceptable. If you guys can't tell, I don't know how to play the kalimba. I mean, some of you guys might actually prefer this, or even I feel like that's too much. You're limiting yourself to one sound there. But that's definitely decent. I feel like that's controlled enough to give you some flexibility. Let's see bass traps on the walls. Fairly good, a little bit clearer. I still hear ambience in the setup you'll see people use in home studios where they'll essentially just create this kind of thing. It's sounding fairly good, a little bit clearer. I still hear around the mics. It might look, guys, so I think from this point I'm going to keep the mic setup exact ambience in the far side of the room, but nothing to be considered as a way to isolate the vocal from the room. And I think it does usable record. Kind of similar, a little bit more ambient in the bass traps, but it's not a bad ambience. Let's see the sound. Do I sound beautiful? I think I do. Testing. This is the voice. Going mono. So that's with the traps in the corners. Good. A little bit clearer. I still voice. How do I sound? Do I sound beautiful? I think actually I do. Sounds a little bit more controlled, surprisingly. But actually that's not surprising because corners, you get all the reflections going on in between the corners. So that makes some sense. Probably get pretty good isolation. So let's just see how this turns out. It's feeling dead, and dead may not be the best solution. Do I sound beautiful? I think I do. Let's just see how this turns out. It's feeling dead, and dead may not be the best solution. Isolate the vocal from the room, and I think it does a decent job, but we'll hear in the results. I know it's not going to be perfect, but if we were to move things around all the time, essentially just create this kind of vocal booth out of fabric. Dead, and dead may not be the best solution. I think there's a lot of, bias against having bass traps and ceiling cloud. Cloud's probably helping. I still hear reflections in the far side of the room. So this is where possibly a more comprehensive set of acoustic treatment can pretty good isolation. So let's just see how this turns out. It's feeling dead, and dead. It's sounding pretty good. The cloud's probably helping. I still hear reflections in the far side of the room. So this is where fully treated. The way it's sounding now is probably pretty in line with a control room at a high level studio. They're back to the stereo. Let's try some instruments. This person isn't even going to get close to this. Reflections in the far side of the room. So this is where okay, so something I really noticed there, aside from the actual change in the ambience, is the amount of isolation from the noise outside. If you guys should all be listening on headphones, by the way. If you turn it up, you can really hear the outside noise there. So the ISO booths are really helping in that situation. But actually having bass traps and just the ceiling cloud seems to be almost as effective in isolation, surprisingly. And it must just be a matter of the outside noise reflecting on the surfaces in the room, getting amplified. Because I would expect an ISO booth to be a pretty dramatic difference between, having traps 10 feet away from you on the ceilings. You'd think you'd still be getting a lot of outside noise, but surprisingly, the cloud makes a big difference there. But kind of hard to hear here, but the fully treated space is definitely the most quiet. And that makes sense. It's more quiet than the bass trap ISO booth. So depending on the kind of recording you're going to be doing, this may or may not be important, because I feel like with the ceiling cloud, that's an acceptable noise floor. But if I were to sample that instrument, at very low dynamics, then even the low noise can become more problematic. So a fully treated space may actually be beneficial. But something worth discussing at this point is, at what point does the controlled acoustic become detrimental to the sound? And I think it's really a conversation of preference, but I personally find this aside from the horrible playing, more inspiring than that. Just feels so stuffy in a way. I mean, not stuffy, but it feels so detached from any acoustic space. Comprehensive set of acoustic treatment can make that probably pretty in line with a control room. Can make that, extra 10%, a little bit of reflection behind me from what I can hear. Studio, they're surprisingly not. The fully treated space just feels like it sucks all of the three-dimensionality out of the sound. And for music, I'm not sure I prefer that. And I could see where there'd be cases where you want absolute control over the audio, maybe for voiceovers and broadcast and in certain sampling contexts. But if you're just recording your own music, for me, I'm really happy with where we're at with the bass traps and the ceiling cloud. Let's check out some of the other instruments though. Just sounds smaller, you know what I mean? There's some room for it to breathe. All right, let's listen to some of the percussive instruments. Wow, okay, that's a big difference. How tiny that sounds next to this. That's insane. I don't know if you guys can hear the flutter echo there. It's really quiet, but you hear this little pingy thing going on without the cloud. So again, for me, I think bass traps on the walls and a ceiling cloud so that all your early reflection points are being covered. I feel like this is the sweet spot because you're not killing all of the ambience. You're getting enough isolation. You're getting enough, room for the sound to breathe. And, especially if you make the traps from scratch, you could probably get this done for well under $1,000. Whereas treating a full space, $5,000 plus, or a ton of your time. So I really feel like it would be hard to justify the fully treated space for most people. Yeah, I don't want to remove all of the room from the instruments, especially things like percussion, where the room essentially becomes an extension of the sound. Drums in particular are so affected by the sound of a room. And I think if you're able to just control the can really hear that pingy flutter echo. Gotta have a cloud. So the bass trap ISO booth had one of the traps above, so it's addressing that pretty well. And you don't need, I like that one. And I think with added reverb, we'd be set. I'm going to go over this in a second. I actually experimented a little bit with reverbs and kind of wanted to get a sense of if we had the fully controlled room and added artificial reverb, are we able to compensate a little bit for the loss of life that we get there? I didn't have enough diffusion to make this room as perfect as it could be. But based on these recordings, what I'd probably do is keep the bass traps with my early reflections, the ceiling cloud, maybe something in the corners, and then the rest of the space, rather than trapping or using acoustic curtains to deaden the sound, I would fill with as much diffusion as I could afford. And you can get these foam grid fuser things from GIK Acoustics for relatively cheap. They're not the prettiest things in the world. I'd prefer wood, but I think having your immediate area controlled with bass traps and then having the rest of the space controlled with diffusion so that you're not getting these ugly pingy things would be the ideal space, and probably the most inspiring space to work in and monitor in. Because I've worked in a room like this where I have no treatment here. And then I've worked in my old space, which was fully treated even more extensively than I did for this test. And the monitoring, it was kind of a weird thing to monitor in that kind of environment. I wasn't used to it. It took me a long time to get used to it. And I actually found that my mixes were not translating as well as I expected. And, you know, there's some people who actually prefer to have the room influence because that represents the average environment where someone is actually going to be listening to the music. They're going to have these differences in nodes and nulls and all that stuff. So it kind of, there's an interesting case there as far as translation is concerned. So let's just check out the fully treated room with reverb and see how that compares to some of the more livelier recordings. Probably pretty in line with a control room at, you know, a high level studio can make that, you know, extra 10% of difference, but maybe it's not a problem. We'll find out. To this, I'd say the way it's sounding now is probably pretty in line with a control room side of the room. So this is where possibly a more sounding pretty. I'm using the Seventh Heaven Room A on this. Yeah, Studio A is a good natural sounding, but not too long of a tail. I mean, it sounds good. Still think that sounds better. You know, it's like you've got the stuffy thing. That's better to me. But let's take this, bass traps and ceiling cloud, which is my favorite, and put some reverb on it and see how it compares to the fully treated space. Because maybe, you know, having the real room plus reverb will sound better, or maybe it'll sound worse. But the only way to know is to try it. Possibly a more comprehensive set of acoustic treatment can make that, you know, extra 10% of difference to this. I'd say the way it's sounding now is probably pretty in line with a control room at, you know, a high level studio. They're surprisingly not perfect. Possibly a more comprehensive set of acoustic treatment can make that, you know. The stuff is super subtle, but for me, it's this clarity in the high end. It's like an openness. You have a little bit of a thing where those higher frequencies don't feel like they're being so constrained. And, you know, you can hear it even with the reverb added. It just feels more, you know, extra 10% of difference, but maybe it's not. Average person isn't even going to get close to this. I'd say can make that, you know, extra 10%. controlled. Okay, so in that case, I mean, you can really hear a reverb is not able to make up for the tone difference. Sounds like a totally different stick, you know? So, let's try the curtains. That's not bad. Just create this kind of vocal booth out of fabric as a album. We'll find out. How's it sound closer? Good. Am I 6 inches? We All right, guys, so my thoughts are this. I am not hearing a significant enough improvement with the fully treated room to justify the extra work and expense and space that it's going to take up in your environment. And as a matter of fact, I feel that the bass traps and the ceiling cloud are sounding better. And that's a much more trimmed down setup. That's a setup that a lot of composers actually are going with. And, you know, it's justifiable to spend, you know, $1,000 for a setup like this. Comprehensive set of acoustic treatment can make that when if you had nothing, you'd get this. But that's okay. Just want to get it. That's a significant improvement, both in terms of the monitoring, which sound like this, to this. Okay. And the beauty of this setup is you put your treatment there and you can leave it, and it works for both monitoring and for doing recording. And you don't have to worry about setting a bunch of stuff up all the time, because let's be honest, like having to set up every time you need to record a kind of ISO booth situation is not fun. And I feel like that can take the fun out of actually just pulling out the guitar, sitting exactly where you are, where your workspace is, and just kind of rocking out. That's what we need. And I feel like with the bass traps and ceiling cloud, that's the ideal situation. So what I would recommend is fork out about $1,000 to do this. And if you can justify a little bit more expense, get some scatter plates and some of these diffusion things that you can put up on the walls to get rid of the flutter echoes, these little pingy effects you get. But other than that, you can get by with fairly little amount of treatment, which is an exciting thing, because I've always been under the assumption that the more bass traps, the better. But from this experiment, at least, that just isn't the case. So anyway, I hope this was a useful experiment. I know it wasn't overly scientific and might be a little bit hard to follow, but what I'm going to do is include all of these excerpts so that you can bring them into your own DAW and experiment. You can put reverbs. You can see if you can match things with effects, so that you know what's going to work for you and your own recording needs. So anyway, it's been a crazy 4-day experience doing this, but I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm Oliver Codd, and I'll catch you on the next one. You're gonna help me carry all the acoustic